Today I thought I would bring you along with me while I make some candles and show you just a little bit of how I make a bunch of batches of different candles sort of all at the same time. I don't know that it's the most efficient way to do it, but it's what is working for me right now. So I'll show you what I'm doing and then sort of talk through it as I'm getting all of these candles ready. The first step is pretty much always cleaning up before I can start working again. There's just always stuff around, and this big table that I work on to make candles is just like one of the few large surface areas I have to put stuff on. So there's always stuff on it. I clean that off first. I start the wax melter so that that can start melting. Usually by the time I get everything set up, it's enough time to have had the wax melt, but I try and do that first just so that I'm not wasting time waiting for it to melt after I've done all the other setup. And then the next step, once I've cleared off this work table, is I put down a big sheet of craft paper as like a sort of tablecloth. And I like using craft paper specifically because I write stuff on it. Like I write which type of candle is going in each spot, and it's just easier to be able to sort of like scribble any notes that I want to, and then at the end of making the candles, I just crumple it all up and throw it in the garbage. Okay, so now that I've marked out which candles I'm making and where they go, now I just have to unwrap all of my tins. This might be one of my least favorite parts of the process because each one of these tins comes individually wrapped in plastic, which I get why they have to do that. A lot of packaging comes wrapped in plastic, but it is so frustrating and feels very wasteful. And these wrappers particularly really drive me nuts. So I hate this part, but it's obviously a necessary part of the process. So I will sort of line up all the tins ahead of time because I'm making tins today in the spots that they need to go in. And once I have enough of those, then I can prep all of my wicks and the wick clips and just get everything really organized so that by the time I have filled up all of my pouring pitchers with the right fragrance oil and then eventually with their wax, that everything's just like sort of ready to go. A lot of this time that it takes to make a big group of candles at once is just all of the prep work. The actual like mixing wax and fragrance oil and then pouring it into the containers, it doesn't really take that long. So that's what I am doing next. Couple of batches. I'm waiting for more wax to melt. I can only get about 2 batches out of 1 Presto pot. I've tried working with a larger wax melter. I have like a makeshift one. It wasn't like intended for melting wax, and the first time I tried it, I don't know, I wasn't totally in love with the process. So I'm still using a small Presto pot, which means I have to refill the wax and let it melt in between each of these pours. I also realized, I don't know if I've talked on here before about the fact that I don't put my wicks in before I pour the wax. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. I think the most standard way of doing it is putting a wick sticker on the bottom of the like wick clip and then securing the wick and the wick clip in the container and pouring the wax into it. And I had seen someone, I think the company is called Simply Curated. I don't know, they're in Michigan, and they had posted about, I think it was them. I'm like nervous that that's not the person who I saw do it, but I think it's them, that they wait until the wax is like cloudy, semi-hard, and then they just like stick the wick in there and it stays secured. And I tried that and I loved it because it's one less step, it's less wasteful. It's also easier to clean out the container when you're done with the candle because there's not that sticker at the bottom that you have to try and get out. So that's what I do now. I pour the wax first, I let it start to cool, and when it gets cloudy, then I put my wicks in. So I'm currently just pouring directly into the containers. I also have played around a lot with the right pour temperature. There's a few different temperatures you work with when you're making candles, depending on the kind of wax that you have, the kind of container you have. I work with 100% soy wax, and I've tried pouring when it's a little bit cooler. I've tried pouring a little bit warmer, and every fragrance oil is different, unfortunately. You think you have your pour temperature down, and then you work with new fragrance oils for the season or introducing something new, and that one just like, it's not as easy of a pour with a new fragrance oil, so I'm always sort of tweaking it. I do think that I have figured out which of my year-round fragrances pour at better temperatures. Like my Palo Santo candle, I pour pretty warm, but that fragrance oil just performs really well regardless of when I pour it. But other ones are definitely more finicky. So that's something you sort of have to figure out for yourself. I think there's different reasons for doing different temperatures. I will say that part of why I work with tins and like opaque containers is that I don't need the glass adhesion to be part of the equation. That's like the way the wax appears on the outside of like a clear glass container. It's just, it doesn't affect the performance, but I just don't want to have to mess with it. And it's another thing to factor in when you're deciding what your pour temperature is. So I don't have to worry about that, but I do like to have as many single pour candles as possible, which just means that I don't have to go back over it with a heat gun to make the top smoother. But that's not always an option, especially when I am introducing seasonal fragrances that I've never worked with before. Sometimes I just don't have the time to like figure out the exact right pour temperature for each fragrance. And so I just use a heat gun to smooth out the tops when I'm done. So that's where I'm sort of at right now. I try to make the most of this time in between waiting, like pouring the wax, waiting for it to cool so I can put the wick clips in there. I try and get all of my labels printed. I maybe work on some other things that I have to do, try and clean up a little bit. I do try and clean as I go as much as possible with a big pour like this because it does get a little out of hand. I have different pouring pitchers for each fragrance, different spoons to stir each fragrance. So there's a lot of mess that happens. So yeah, I try and do a little bit of that while I'm waiting. And I'm also, to be honest, watching Love Island. So, you know, you gotta find ways to keep yourself entertained while you're doing some of the more boring tasks in a business. And trashy UK television is how I'm doing it today. So that's basically it for my candle making process. It's pretty straightforward. I think that if you're looking to get into fragrance-based products, candles are a super fun one to start off with. I think there's a lot of different variables that are kind of tricky to figure out, like what wax you're going to use, what wick goes with that wax, and the size of the container, and all of those sorts of things are definitely tricky. But as opposed to soap, which I started with, which is super intimidating in terms of working with lye and the recipe working out, and there's a lot more I feel like that could go wrong with soap than with candles. So they're a really fun one to start with, and they make such great gifts. So if you aren't already making candles, there are a lot of candle making kits that you can buy. I do candle making classes. If you're in the Milwaukee area, reach out to me and we can set something up. But I think it's such a fun and like satisfying making process. If you just want to do it for a hobby or if you're doing it for a business, it's a really great product to make. It's something that almost everybody loves. And it allows you to play around with fragrances, figure out what you like, and make something that people really use. So I am excited to wrap up this batch. I'm gonna make notes. I have a spreadsheet of all the batches that I do because I number them all and put that number on the warning label before I label them all and send them out into the world, just so that I know. And yeah, that is my big to-do for today. I've got other things to work on, but it is very satisfying to get this batch over and done with. Thank you so much for watching. If you have other questions about candle making or soap making or anything that I do, please feel free to leave a comment for a future video. I try and answer as many comments as I can. I really appreciate all of you watching, and I will see you in the next video.